All right, handing it over to you, Rita.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let's just do a little bit of level setting here. Of course, our local government partners, we had a meeting last Thursday, so I think everyone's very familiar with overall requirements. But for the benefit of the housing project teams that are able to join us today, want to call out the applicant guidebook, which is posted on DEQ's website. Very, very helpful information in there. Encourage you all to take a look at it if you haven't seen it already. But yeah, just kind of thinking big picture about this program. It truly is a statewide pilot program. And we have a total of about $25 million. We're distributing that through 9 local government partners. And we have 2 primary strategies here. The building reuse, for which there is an incentive of $45,000 per housing unit. And the other strategy is space efficient housing based on the number of bedrooms per unit. And that incentive is $20,000 per unit. Next slide, please, Jordan. Yeah, and here's just a nice snapshot of our local partners again, and the respective allocations for each of those partners. Next slide, Jordan. Here's just a quick snapshot of the overall process that applicants will go through. First step is to complete the application. Local governments will be looking at your application to make sure everything is up to par and meet all the requirements. Then that next step is a rebate agreement, which is actually a contract just to, ink all the terms, make sure everyone understands what they're walking into. Next step that we really, really strongly encourage each and all housing project teams to do is to figure out what is the pathway that makes sense for their respective project to meet the low embodied carbon requirement. And that's what this meeting is all about. That's what Jordan and Aurora will take us through. And just to remind folks, rebate payments don't happen until the very end of the project, after you have your certificate of occupancy and all the required documentation. Next slide, please, Jordan. And then just a super recap of the 5 major requirements, right? First step is either reuse project or space efficient project in one of the locales with our local government partners. There is an affordability requirement. No short-term rentals are eligible for the rebate. We're looking for long-term housing here. There's also an affordability requirement in that the new housing units must be available at 120% AMI per your local jurisdiction. Next slide. This is a federal funding. So if Build America, Buy America applies, project teams need to comply with that. We have done a lot of vetting with local government partners and some of you on the call. We think this is not going to apply to many, hopefully not any of our projects, but that is something we want folks to be aware of. And if you do have any questions about that, the DEQ team is more than happy to talk through that with you. Requirement 4 is the low embodied carbon requirement. And again, that's what today is all about. And then just to remind folks, there is a time frame requirement. Projects must be completed and submit all your, rebate request and all by the end of March 2029, which feels like a long time away, but it'll be here before we know it with housing projects. So I'll pass it back to the CLF team.
Great, thanks, Rita. I am going to stop sharing and give an opportunity for Aurora to share screen and present the next section. I think she has joined, and I believe she is calling in by phone. So we will see how this goes, and I will continue sharing if need be. So passing it to you, Aurora.
Hey, Jordan. Actually, if you don't mind sharing on this section, I think I'll be able to work it out for the next one, but Teams is giving me more privacy issues, but I hope you can hear me now.
We can hear you, and I will start
Okay.
sharing.
Thank you. Teams is not my friend this morning. Appreciate you bearing with me, and Jordan, you, just elegantly facilitating. All right. Okay, great. So the goal here is to really put the embodied carbon requirements into context and explain to you all what to expect for this dimension of the program. Go ahead. Next slide. Thank you. As Rita mentioned, the focus of today's presentation is really on requirement 4. The aim here is to reduce the embodied carbon of your new buildings, of new building materials by 10%. And we're providing several compliance pathways to make this possible. The other piece of our program is Jordan and I and others at CLF are providing technical assistance to teams that are working through this process. And we are really here to support you and encourage you getting in touch with us early in your project in order to get that advice early on. Go ahead. The way this part of the program is structured is we have 4 potential pathways. The aim of these 4 pathways is to provide options for you all to be able to comply with different possibilities in play. Option 1 is called the material shortlist pathway. And this pathway focuses on a very small subset of materials, concrete, rebar, insulation, and flooring, and asks you to make a bigger reduction in those materials of 20%, which equates to a reduction at the scale of the whole building of about 10%. So therefore, it satisfies that requirement 4. Pathway 2 works really similar to pathway 1. It's just a longer list of materials that you see on the bottom of the screen here. Cement and concrete, CMU and rebar, among many others. And by achieving an 11% reduction in that subset, that's consistent with about 10% reduction at the scale of the project. So both pathways 1 and 2 have you focus on these smaller material subsets as an indicator. Pathways 3 and 4 actually look at the building more holistically. Pathway 3 is a prescriptive checklist, which is a simplified method of compliance that allows you to check off several measures, and that's indicative of your 10% reduction. And then pathway 4 uses a whole building model of your housing project to demonstrate an embodied carbon reduction. The whole session today is basically reviewing these pathways and helping you understand what this all means. If embodied carbon is a new term, we want to explain to all of you what this is about. This is an area that has not been the focus of the green building industry for the last 10 or 20 years, but it's a really important piece of where carbon emissions come from in buildings. And what we mean when we say embodied carbon is this is a reference to the greenhouse gas emissions that are generated through different parts of the supply chain of our buildings. This includes extraction and transportation and manufacturing, as well as parts of the construction process that come later, like transit, replacement of materials over the building life cycle, and processing and end of life. You'll notice that operations here in blue looks a little different than all the emissions illustrated in yellow. And that's because operational carbon, which is that energy, that's being consumed over the life of the building, is not part of embodied carbon. So this program is actually focused on the material supply chains and the processes it takes to put our buildings into place. Next slide. The DEQ program specifically is focused on upfront carbon, this product stage. So it's actually very It's focused on manufacturing as well as extraction and transportation of materials. As you'll notice on the right side of the screen here, Pathway 3 also considers emissions from replacement of materials to some extent. So there's a little bit of integration of the use stage of the life cycle of a building. But in general, this program as a whole is quite focused on this product stage. As you kind of get into embodied carbon and read through the guidance, you'll notice that there's often these letter and number abbreviations, like you'll see on the right here, A1, A2, and A3. And these are called submodules. And really all they do is help us refer to individual instances along the supply chain more consistently. So to put this another way, the DEQ program is focused on A1 to A3, which considers raw material supply, transportation to the factory, and the manufacturing of those materials. And as I mentioned, this B4, this replacement stage, is also considered in Pathway 3 specifically, which is that checklist pathway. And we'll talk more about this later, but just when you hear these abbreviations, A1 to A3, it's just referencing the chunk of the supply chain that is in focus. You might be wondering why the program focuses on embodied carbon and what this all means. And we want to raise that if you look at construction across the US broadly, about 75 or 76% of construction is private and 25% is public. And emissions from housing, the greenhouse gas emissions from housing, really live in this private chunk of the overall puzzle. Non-residential buildings contribute about 22% to the overall construction spending. Multifamily residential is about 25%, and single family is about 23%. So you can see if you sum those two together, if you go to the next slide, Jordan, it's about 48% of the overall construction spending in the US is residential, and that's indicative of how much of the emissions of embodied carbon in the US are coming from residential projects. It might also be helpful for folks that have been working on buildings for a long time and thinking of operational emissions and how your energy systems are working on your projects to understand the relationship and embodied carbon. This is one example of a series of multifamily residential units constructed in California over a 60-year life cycle. And this subset of buildings suggests that embodied carbon is about as important as operational carbon over that 60-year life cycle. So what that means is when you build the building at the start of the life, that is about as much emissions associated with that as operational carbon, which recurs along the life of a building year over year. So these things are really, in many states, in many regions, very equivalent in terms of their overall contribution to global warming. As one of the primary drivers of how we constructed this program, we looked at which materials in buildings are contributing the most to the overall emissions. This is a graphic that displays the product stage, again, that A1 to A3 piece of the supply chain, and which materials are contributing. This is a sample of that for DEQ specifically and the kinds of housing that we're expecting to be in this program. So it is more customized to this program in Oregon. And you'll see the heavy hitting materials here include concrete, rebar, wood, insulation, cladding, and finishes. There's also impacts associated with windows, and then the rest of the building, all the other materials, account for about 12%. And really, we've used this breakdown to help inform how these pathways are set up, so that if you're focusing on a subset of materials, you're still getting the biggest share of impacts in the building. Go ahead. Great. So the method that's used to do embodied carbon analysis is called life cycle assessment. And in its simplest form, life cycle assessment is very simple math. You basically take the quantities of things that are installed in your project, how much concrete, how much rebar, and you're multiplying those quantities by an emissions factor per material. So how carbon intensive is that cubic yard of concrete? And that math, the quantity times the emissions factor, will get you the global warming potential, which is really the unit of embodied carbon. Of all of the pathways, they all work on this logic. There are also kind of two levels of data that are being used in these calculations. So the first is product data, usually paid for by a manufacturer to represent a specific product, and it's disclosed in something called an environmental product declaration. We're going to talk a lot about those documents later in the session. There's also project data. It's used primarily for this program that an architect, engineer, or contractor might use to represent the portion of the building under consideration. Go ahead. This is going to get more discussion later, but just to give a small preview, product declarations are this disclosure type that we mean when we're talking about specific products. Right, you can see this is an example of a reinforcing bar in one of the early pages of this disclosures. And these documents help you identify the emissions impacts associated with 1 ton of rebar or something like that. They also come in two types. They can be product specific, where they represent an individual rebar coming from a specific mill, or they can be industry wide. And that would mean they represent rebar in general, rebar on average. Go ahead. To kind of connect those two scales of data to these programs, pathways 1 and 2 emphasize product scale. Pathways are built on these EPDs, these environmental product declarations, and they're focused on these subset of products. So look at the EPDs or impacts of concrete, rebar, and insulation, or a longer list. And that's different from pathways 3 and 4, which really zoom out and look at the project more holistically. You can still include EPDs and project scale reduction, but you can also include larger design measures. My last slide here is just giving you a feel for the different scales of opportunities to create embodied carbon reductions on your projects, which is really the goal of this program, is to reward the actions that you are all taking to satisfy this requirement for. And I would say these reduction strategies here are grouped into really 3 types. One that's very high level, project design and concept. The second, that's materials and system selection, focused on material systems within the building. And the third is specification, so individual products and where those are coming from and being supplied from. Examples of the first type include things like reducing below grade construction, so getting rid of, heavy concrete structures underground, using more efficient structures, optimizing window to wall ratio, how much window is in your building, or minimize structures. In the second category, it would include things like designing out unnecessary systems, designing for lower carbon insulation, for example, loose fill cellulose, using lower carbon or using salvage materials. These are all examples of material alternatives. And then the last category here is specifications and procurement. And this is really rewarding lower carbon mix designs or an insulation that is lower carbon than its competitors. So in general, pathways 3 and 4 can reward the reduction strategies in the first 2 columns here, as well as the third column. And 1 and 2 are more focused on this last column, really honing in on your products and what you can provide and supply your individual housing project. I'll leave it there. I want to ask first, are there any questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question. What we're finding, and we're starting with, we're going to try to explore all the pathways, but we're starting with the first pathway. And what we're finding is that the two kind of like key gatekeepers to the pathways that you said that you have outlined, the product scale or the project scale, it seems like they're what we're finding in trying to track these down and fulfill these requirements is that there are two main gatekeepers. The people who write the EPDs, and then the people who would potentially model the whole building model for. And so I guess my question, and those are like highly specified things. When we go to our manufacturer, we're like, we need an EPD. And oftentimes they're like, what is that? How do I get one? I want to give you one. I don't know where to start. Do you have a list of to really drill down on how an EPD gets made? Like, do you have a list of consultants that we can put these manufacturers in touch with? Because Jordan, you're probably familiar. My go-to has been like, I don't know. Here's Jordan. But to potentially avoid and minimize that, are there consultants that you guys that I could help kind of like look for that would help these manufacturers like get in touch with someone who can put together an EPD for their products? And then second to that, we're hoping to meet these requirements through that first pathway. But if we do have to go through the whole building life cycle assessment, that's another kind of like very highly specialized niche field where I feel like that's kind of a gatekeeper. And if there are contacts that you guys can provide for that, that would be also great. And those are just my two questions. And you don't have to answer on the spot, but if you email me those, that would be awesome too.
Yeah, really, really good question. I think we're going to cover a little bit of this in the next part of the presentation. And I think there are different consultants for different materials. And there are some materials that can generate, some manufacturers produce materials that can generate EPDs much faster, mainly materials like concrete. And then other EPDs are sometimes a longer development process. So for instance, if there's an insulation that you're looking to get, the lead time may be 6 months or more to get an EPD. And I think that your suggestion of providing consultants is a good one. And I think we're going to talk about our technical support line as well, which is another way to reach out to us and say, hey, I am looking to source this product from manufacturer X. Could you give them some suggestions of where to go get EPDs and how to do that? And I think that's very much a question we can help support through this work with DEQ. Aurora, anything to add here?
I just want to see if you can hear me, because I think I just got the privacy settings working finally.
We can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Then I'm back in business. Thanks for answering that one.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Any other questions before we keep going?
I have one other quick question, and it's probably not, and it might just be better to email it. The only reason I'm asking is because I have to jump off in a second here. But the first part of the process mentioned an application. Is it the county who receives the money that submits that application? Does the project submit an application to the county receiving the funds or directly to TEQ? And is that probably all explained in the online?
That is explained in the applicant guidebook. But just to answer it is the application, you should send that to your local government partner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then maybe one more thing, Jennifer, if you have to go soon. I think one of the things that we're going to stress later on in the presentation is that Oregon DEQ's low embodied carbon housing program is not the only program either requiring or requesting EPDs in the state right now. So there is a lot of demand for these types of disclosures. And the big one coming up right now is Oregon Department of Transportation. Starting in January of 2026, they're going to require EPDs for all steel, concrete, asphalt, and shotcrete, precast, you name it. So it's a pretty long list of materials, and we're hoping that demand for EPDs is really going to get a few of the manufacturers who have yet to pull the trigger to get over that hump and actually produce more EPDs.
Oh yeah, we found a lot of willingness to explore this with concrete specifically.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I'm gonna keep moving here. I'm assuming everybody could see my slides. Thank you, Rita. And all right, let's cover the details of pathways 1 and 2 right now. I'll do that, and then I'm going to pass it back to Aurora to cover the details of pathways 3 and 4.
Hey, Jordan.
Yes.
There is one more question in the chat from Ellen. I don't know if you want to answer that now or if you'll get to it, but just want to flag it in case now's a good time.
Oh, please, would you mind reading it out? I have multiple
I can, absolutely,
balancing
yes.
screens here. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, so the question is, and maybe this is a question for DEQ. So I'll read it out and we can determine. So will DEQ contact local concrete and rebar manufacturers and start the ball rolling? So I guess maybe, Rita, this is a question for us, for getting EPDs for the material. And then several developers working on the program could use that particular manufacturer. Maybe I'll just start, but Rita, Jordan, others jump in. So Jordan and Aurora will present here on how those EPDs that already exist can be accessed. So you'll see a little bit more about that, Ellen. DEQ is not currently expecting to reach out to those local manufacturers. If there are any project teams that have a difficult time getting access to EPDs, I think that's a conversation we could have later. But there are also, I don't know, Jordan and Aurora, if you're going to talk about how many EPDs are already on the market and what that kind of looks like. So I'll turn it over if anyone else wants to jump in and add to that.
Yeah, I can add. We will talk about how many EPDs are currently on the market, and two things. We only have one steel rebar manufacturer in the state right now. They already have an EPD. There's a lot of steel rebar fabricators in the state. They don't have EPDs, and that's okay. And because we have EPDs for unfabricated rebar. The concrete manufacturers have all received a call. Every single one of them have received a call already from the Oregon Department of Transportation saying that if you want to bid on ODOT jobs starting in 2026, you're going to need an EPD. So people know about this. They know about the demand. It's mostly through the ODOT program. And I'll leave it up to DEQ as to whether or not they want to do individual outreach to manufacturers about the demand from this program, because there is a pretty long runway, right? This projects can go all the way till 2029 here. So there is a long runway, a long demand, and continued, which is a really good message for manufacturers to hear. I also want to stress that we're talking a lot about EPDs, but only 2 of the pathways actually require EPDs, and that's part of our recognition that not every project is going to be able to get through these requirements by just using EPDs. And so we will talk more about pathways 3 and 4, which are really alternative ways to achieve the program requirements, and in many ways, what you can do if there are no EPDs present in your market. All right, so let's jump into pathways 1 and 2. As I say, we're going to talk more about EPDs and then less about EPDs. So let's go for it. So pathway 1 here requires a combined 20% reduction in the purchases of concrete, rebar, insulation, and flooring. Pathway 2 requires a combined 11% reduction in this much larger list of materials that includes concrete, rebar, shotcrete, CMU, steel, lumber, cladding, flooring, wallboard, and insulation. Pretty long list. You'll notice that neither pathway requires an exact 10% reduction as the program requirements outline. And let's take a look at why is that? Why don't pathways 1 and 2 just require a 10% reduction? These charts show the total material contributions of a typical residential building that we're using for this project here in Oregon. Aurora showed this chart a little earlier where it had a lot of pretty colors. But in this particular chart, I've just highlighted the green slices of the pie chart that represent the materials included in each pathway. And for pathway 1, you'll see that there are fewer materials in this pathway, which equates to greater reductions needed for the materials that are left in order to achieve a 10% overall reduction. Now, pathway 2 has a much more complete list of materials, which is why you just need an 11% reduction in these materials to equate to an overall 10% reduction at the project scale. Now, that's why we see different reduction targets in different pathways. Now, we've been talking a lot about reductions so far, and you're likely wondering, reductions compared to what? What are we actually comparing to when we're seeking these different reductions? In this program, we're comparing to what we call baselines. Now, what are baselines? Baselines are the reference values against which comparisons can be made. This table shows a selection of the baselines that are used in this program. Baselines are embodied carbon intensities per unit of product. Higher numbers mean more emissions, lower numbers mean less emissions. Embodied carbon measured at the product scale is essentially a measure of manufacturing efficiency. So when we see lower numbers in a product category, we're seeing that manufacturer produces that material more efficiently. And just like the energy we use on our buildings, more efficiency is good when we're talking about manufacturing. Now, you'll notice the source all the way on the right here of most of these baselines is the recently published Carbon Leadership Forum Material Baselines Report. And let's take a closer look at where these baselines come from. We at CLF have been publishing material baselines since 2019. The CLF baseline values represent an estimate of industry average greenhouse gas emissions for construction materials manufactured in North America. Now, we don't just make these baselines up out of thin air. Approximately 80% of these values come from industry average EPDs. These EPDs, these disclosure documents that we were talking about so much, what they do is they collect data from lots of different manufacturers across one industry, and then they aggregate the results to represent the average production impacts of that particular product. Recently, the new LEED version 5 green building rating system referenced CLF baselines as the source against which embodied carbon comparisons should be made in their rating system. This is kind of a big deal. We're really excited about it. And what it means for your projects right now on the ground is that if any of your projects are also going for LEED certification, they're going to be aligning the same baselines we're using on our projects with the ones that they're using in the LEED certification program. So that's a good thing. Now, for all materials except for concrete, CLF and DEQ chose national production averages because most materials we can source locally, regionally, and nationally. When we build in Oregon, our products actually come from all over the place. However, since concrete is a locally produced material, we did utilize more local data to represent the baselines for that particular product. Now, generally, if we want to decarbonize the industrial sector in North America, we need to be purchasing products below the North American average to show demand and preference for lower carbon materials. So fundamentally, that's why we're looking for a 10% reduction from baselines in pathways 1 and 2. Now that we've established what a baseline is, where they come from, you're probably wondering how to show reductions from the baseline in these pathways. And lo and behold, the infamous EPD, which we've been talking about a lot, is in fact the the mechanism that you use to prove that your purchased products on the projects you're working on actually show embodied carbon reductions from the baselines. So let's talk a little bit more about EPDs now. We use EPDs to measure and disclose the carbon impacts of building materials. EPDs are like the nutrition facts label on a side of a box of cereal, but instead of disclosing calories and fat and cholesterol, we're measuring embodied carbon impacts and other environmental impacts and disclosing them through this label. Now here in this slide, I've highlighted the embodied carbon metric shown in EPDs. Aurora mentioned this earlier. It's called global warming potential, or GWP. And so at the end of the day, again, these are just labels that disclose how efficiently a product is made. Lower numbers mean fewer impacts. And these are the types of labels that we can help use, that we can use to help buy lower carbon products. Fortunately, Oregon has a lot of EPDs. This chart shows EPDs per state and Canadian province in both US and Canada. And we can see that Oregon has the third highest count of EPDs on the continent, which is really great to support programs like this one. Most of the EPDs we have in Oregon, the vast majority, are concrete EPDs. However, we do have a pretty good mix of other materials as well. I already mentioned steel rebar from McMinnville. We have some good drywall EPDs coming out of Rainier, Oregon. We've got some doors coming out of Southern Oregon. Lots of asphalt EPDs, not applicable for this particular program, but that's a growing sector of EPDs. And a number of different wood EPDs around the state, mostly for engineered wood products and just a couple for solid sawn lumber. The other things I want to highlight here is that, again, I mentioned this earlier, when Jennifer asked, what other resources or what other sort of signals are manufacturers getting. There are a number of programs around the state that are demanding EPDs for more transparency and wanting to track and lower their purchases of building materials. City of Portland, Metro, and Eugene all have concrete EPD requirements for their purchases of concrete. And like I mentioned, ODOT will start requiring EPDs on most projects starting in January 2026. All right. Finally, before hopping into the compliance tracking form and an example project, I wanted to cover the supporting documentation needed if you choose pathways 1 or 2. Now, for each pathway, you'll need basically a web link to the EPD used to achieve the carbon reduction targets on your project. And then also you'll need to attach the receipts for the purchased and installed materials that have EPDs. The DEQ program is not looking for receipts from every material you've purchased for the project, just the receipts for the materials that you're using to claim compliance. All right, so I'm gonna stop here and pause. We're about to jump into the compliance reporting form, some spreadsheets, some details where I'm going to share screen for a while, but I do want to stop here to see if there are any questions. Try it. All right, get the right screen up. Okay, I can see you all now. Yeah, feel free to raise a hand if there are any questions or just speak up. Okay, I see one coming through the chat. Can you comment on the prices of these rated materials compared to non-rated materials? That's a really good question. We do not have any comprehensive studies of the cost comparison of low embodied carbon products to business as usual purchases. Those studies just simply do not exist right now. When we're talking about some of these main materials, low carbon concrete, low carbon rebar, many of the strategies used to actually produce these materials are also money savers for the manufacturers themselves. So we know through, for instance, the City of Portland's concrete program that in most cases, it's a cost neutral swap to have a low carbon concrete for a business as usual concrete. In some cases, contractors have had to raise prices as much as 5% to account for different installation practices and having them adjust to newer concrete mixes. So these are all findings through the City of Portland's program, but they've found either cost parity or reductions, and in some cases, no more than a 5% increase in cost. Fortunately, there's a lot of money on the table for these projects at $20,000 per unit or $45,000 per unit for the reuse. So I think part of the incentive here is to hope to offset some of the potential increase in costs that any project teams may incur for this.
I can share my experience too. So far with rebar and concrete, we don't have any cost impacts. The only cost impact is the cost of getting the EPD, which was low.
And Jennifer, that wasn't passed on to your project teams, right? That cost was to the manufacturer, right?
I'm not actually sure how it's going to shake out, but it was low enough that even if it is, we'll do it. It's fine.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think, for things like concrete, plants can get EPDs between 30 and 50 EPDs, which covers the vast majority of the mixes they have for between $3,000 and $5,000. And it can take up to about 6 months. So we're not talking about extreme costs here. And again, this is not the only program asking for these types of disclosures. Yes, it could be a great student research project as far as a good comment on how cost is impacted. And I mean, maybe just to reflect a little bit, we get this question a lot. And I think part of the challenge is that there's a difference between cost and price, right? Sometimes the cost of products or green products and lower products is inflated, not because the product actually costs more for the manufacturer to produce, but it's because they have a market for it and want to take advantage of that market. And that's a real thing. That's part of business. The other thing is that labor costs in construction fluctuate quite a bit. And it's sometimes hard to decipher what is an increase in labor costs versus what is an increase in actual material costs. So those two things make it a little challenging, but maybe that's something we can find out more about through this project and understand whether your teams are incurring any more costs. Really good questions. And for others like Jennifer did, if you have personal experience on this, and whether it's on projects through this program or other projects that you're familiar with that are in your jurisdiction or other things that you've worked on, please do chime in. This is a community learning session. We're all trying to get up to speed together here. So really encourage others to speak up. Okay. I am going to now jump into, and Aurora, I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here. We're at an hour into it. So we do have a break built in. So bear with us here. I'm gonna start showing the compliance reporting form. So let's jump into this. There's a lot of details on this Excel spreadsheet here, and so we are not going to cover all of them, but I'm going to do my best to sort of give you a big picture overview of what compliance looks like and how project teams might use this. So really big picture here, I'm going to highlight these rows. The first thing, okay, actually down at the bottom here, so we have pathway 1, pathway 2, and pathway 3. These 3 pathways are currently captured in the spreadsheet. When the final program materials are published over the coming month, this will all be available to you via the DEQ website and something that you can download and play with. And if you have questions or comments, that's when you can reach out directly to the CLF team and we can provide technical support to walk you through things. But here we go. So we're going to just focus on pathway 1 here right now because it's fewer materials and a little simpler. So the first thing we're asking project teams are, what are you buying? What are the covered products that are included in your project, right? This particular one only covers concrete, steel, insulation, and flooring. Then we're asking, how much of it are you buying? What are the quantities that you are putting in your building? The next section of the reporting form talks about this GWP baselines. You don't have to put anything in here. These baselines automatically populate as you choose something from the dropdown. So I'm choosing a 3000 PSI concrete. I'm going to use 10 cubic yards of it. Here's the baseline that automatically populated. And here's the total GWP calculated for that particular product. The next part is the actual project GWP. Ooh, I actually have an EPD for my concrete. And you know what? Good news, it's less than 261, which is the baseline. I have a great concrete supplier that says they can hit the 200 mark. Excellent. So they hit the 200 mark, and what do I see? I see that we were able to reduce concrete impacts by 23% for this individual product. Down at the bottom, we then see whether or not what the total percent reduction is for this particular project. And if it's compliant, green will show up as compliant, and if it's not compliant, a red will show up. We're going to talk more about this in the next example. The last column is for documentation. So here's where we want you to put a web link for your EPD and then provide the name of your receipt that you are attaching to your submittal. So again, that's all we need for documentation. What EPD did you use? And show us that you actually purchased this product through a receipt. Okay, so that is the spreadsheet. And I want to emphasize that you do not need an EPD for every product that you use on your project. But if I choose this pathway, pathway 1, I can't just put in the quantities for just the material that I buy. Oh, sorry, I'm having monitor issues. I need to put in all the quantities for the materials that are listed here. So I know I'm using rebar. I'm going to be using unfabricated rebar from McMinnville. They say I've got about, a tenth of a US ton. I know I'm using insulation in this case. What type of insulation am I using? Well, I'm actually going to use XPS insulation on my foundation. And how many square feet am I going to use? I don't know, maybe 200. I'm also going to use XPS under my slab. So how much am I going to use? Probably about 1,000 square feet under my slab. I'm using blanket insulation, so on and so forth. So you do you do have to put your quantities in. And if you notice, when I just had one material in that achieved a 23% reduction, things were looking great. I was compliant with the program. I achieved a 20% reduction. But when you put in all of your other quantities, we can see that, all right, well, if I don't have an EPD for these other materials, I default to the baseline values. And so I'm currently only achieving a 10% reduction in this particular project. And again, I haven't even filled out all my quantities yet. So that's a basic overview. I want to emphasize that pathway 2 is just like pathway 1, just with a longer list of materials. So we can see that all of these materials here are adding to the opportunities to reduce embodied carbon on the project. We're not going to use pathway 2 right now as an example because it's just simpler to deal with 4 materials. Okay.
There is a question in the chat, Jordan.
For pathway 1, you are just filling out quantities for those listed materials. Right, that is correct. That's all you need to do is fill out the quantities for the listed materials. And if all I did was list the quantities and said, yeah, I'm using 1,000 square feet of loose fill insulation. And yep, I'm using a bunch of vinyl composite tile for my flooring. What I can see here is that here's all my quantities. Here's all of the impacts, right? And what's showing here is like what are some of the biggest impacts? Oh, and I'm sorry, for your insulation, you do need to fill out your R values so that we know for foundation XPS, it's R15, we know it's R10, and then we know it's R21 in the walls. So what does that give us? That shows us a couple of things here. And this is also an interesting thing to look at is that, what are the biggest numbers here? When we look at this, we see the big numbers are the ones that contribute to embodied carbon the most. So we see this 4,000 PSI concrete is our biggest, heavier hitter. So if I'm going to start looking for EPDs, I'm probably going to start here in my biggest materials because I'm likely to get bigger reductions from the bigger pieces. So yes, you have to fill out all of your quantities, but if you don't have any EPDs for any of these materials, you can see that you're not achieving a 20% reduction. Let me read the other comment. Maybe I'm off a bit, but if we're doing all these existing buildings, there won't be much concrete. Yeah, where there may be floor insulation and drywall framing material. Yeah, really good point. We designed every pathway with the intention that it has an opportunity to achieve program goals for both space efficient and reuse projects. So you're right. We're not going to be using a lot of concrete and steel likely in reuse projects because we're reusing the existing structure. But we will be using a lot of insulation probably and new or salvaged flooring. And so there is a smaller subset of materials that would be relevant in pathway 1 for reuse projects. It may be more difficult for reuse projects to use pathway 1 to achieve a full 20% reduction. But let's say you and 5. So let's say I'm on a reuse project and I'm sourcing some lower carbon insulation. I'm able to achieve a 55% reduction and some lower carbon flooring. But look, I wasn't able to get to 20%. I was only able to get to 14%. Well, you know what? I'm using other materials on my reuse project and none of them are listed here. So what would I do? Well, I would then copy my quantities and I would go over to pathway 2 and I'd start filling in pathway 2 and saying, oh, wait, pathway 2 includes cladding. And I'm sourcing new cladding for my project, and I happen to be using cedar siding, which is going to give me some points in this program. And you may be able to achieve more reductions and achieve a full 11% reduction in pathway 2. And then Aurora will explain how there's multiple pathways for the reuse part of the program in 3 and 4 as well.
Yeah. The other thing I would add there is it's as simple as if you're a reuse project and you don't have any ready mix concrete, you can skip that line or you can put a 0 in that quantity and pathway 1 is still available to you. So that just really increases the influence that your insulation and flooring products will have on the overall percent reduction. So basically they'll have greater weight and your choices for flooring will matter more in your overall percent reduction. So I would still start with pathway 1 because your flooring will have greater influence on your ability to comply.
Yeah, thank you, Aurora. And like she suggested, I just deleted the materials that I'm not sourcing on my products. And again, this is a hypothetical example, but look, when I put in all my insulation quantities, I put in my flooring, and this completely fake example is achieving 34%. So that's good advice. All right, I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I'm going to swap real quick and give another example here. I want to show we did this part already, and I want to show an example single family home project using Pathway 1 and maybe a little bit of the workflow of what someone might do. You should all be really happy that you're not hiring me to be your architect, because this is pretty much the extent of how I design different structures. This is the best I can do. And this project, this hypothetical project, is going to be located in Eugene. This is one of the projects, one of the cities that space efficient projects can be built. Here's my list of materials. And this pretty accurately represents what a single family home material quantities might look like. And so here's my materials. And for the sake of time, I've pre-populated these into the Pathway 1 spreadsheet. So again, here's all my materials. And these, I've entered them into the project specific quantities. I've chosen what my units are. And then I've gone through all the math, right? And I've said, wow, for a lot of these products, like the concrete, I was able to find EPDs through my local supplier that achieved 21% reduction or 12% reduction. I've put links to all of the individual places, all of the individual EPDs that we were able to source on this project. And we were able to achieve a 22% reduction in this particular project. Now, I'm just going to go through a hypothetical scenario here. Let's just say for this loose fill insulation that we were using for the attic, we weren't able to find an EPD for the cellulose that we were blowing in, right? And so unfortunately, we were not compliant on Pathway 1, and we've only achieved a 15% reduction. So what would I do? I would then look to see what other materials I'm using. It looks like I'm using some carpet and I'm using some resilient flooring. Maybe we should go look to see if we're able to find some carpet. So this is what's called the EC3 tool. This is a tool that collects all of the EPDs produced in North America and puts it in one tool. This is one of the best sources to find EPDs for your project. And for this particular one, why don't we take a look and figure out if we can find some carpet. So I want to go to Find and Compare Materials. I want to go to Finishes. In this particular, I'm looking for flooring. I'm then looking for carpet. I click on the EPD button. It does a search. And then there's a bunch of different types of carpet, right? I know I'm going to be using these in the bedroom, so I'm not going to be using tiles, but I'm going to be using broadloom. This is the type of carpet I would like to use in the project. I'm going to hit search. And then all of the carpets, in this case, globally. And so I could also limit my search to different areas. In this case, I would like to limit my search not just to North America, but I would like to buy carpet that's made in the United States. So I click OK. I click search. We know most of the carpet here is actually made in Georgia. So if I were just to limit my geography to Oregon, we wouldn't find any carpet manufacturers. But it's a good thing to play around with to figure out. Now I get a really long list of all the different manufacturers and products that have carpet EPDs. There's all these different GWP values here, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how many EPDs do I have? Oh wow, I have 564 EPDs. That's a lot to deal with. How do I find the ones that are compliant to our program? Well, I'm going to look back at the our spreadsheet and say, well, what is our baseline value? What do I need to beat here? We need to find carpet that is less than 10.1 kilograms CO2e per square meter. So I'm going to go back to my EC3 tool. Whoops. And I'm going to put 10.1 right here. And I'm going to hit enter. It's going to do some working. And it is then mostly why 17 million? But most of these, I can then, it organizes them by value. I could then look on here, like, wow, these aren't quite low enough. I wonder if there's a even lower carbon carpet. What about this one? This 8.2. And so I'm going to look at this one. I'm going to say, yeah, this one maybe is good for my project. I'm going to open the individual material. If I want to look at the actual EPD, there's a way to download the EPD directly. I'm going to hit this button. It's going to download to my computer. I'm going to look at the EPD. I'm going to decide, wow, this looks like commercial office carpet instead of bedroom carpet. But either way, I'm just trying to demonstrate that, this is a part of the workflow that you might use. You might also use the EC3 tool to say, I already know that I want Shaw carpet. And there's ways to do searches by manufacturers here. And I could say, is Shaw in there? Yeah, Shaw flooring is in there. So then I could just search by Shaw flooring. So I'm not going to spend too much time on driving through this Building Transparency EC3 tool, but I just wanted to demonstrate this is one way that you find EPDs. So I could find an EPD for a product that I'm actually able to source, plug the value in and see if I'm able to make it. If I'm not able to achieve the reduction target in this particular pathway, I have a few choices. Number one, I could look for more EPDs for other products that didn't have them, like the carpets here, like the loose fill insulation. I could also say, you know what, I'm going to expand my palette of materials and go into pathway 2 to see if maybe I could list, because I know that I can get more gypsum board from USG and Rainier, Oregon, and those would be low carbon. You can also use partial points from pathways 1 and 2 and incorporate that into pathway 3, which Aurora will cover. And then finally, you could also use pathway 4, which is a whole building LCA pathway. So there's lots of different paths for compliance, and that's kind of the point, is that there's not one size fits all for projects. This is why we encourage folks to reach out for technical support early. We could probably help save you a lot of time by understanding a little bit more about your project, where you're located, what types of materials you're looking to source, and that types of things. So I think I'm going to stop here, see if there's any questions before I hand it over to Aurora. I think it's probably time to move on. Any quick questions?
All right. Jordan, I might suggest we take the 5-minute break now just because of how far through the session time we are. Are you okay with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So let's group at 11:25. And I see, Charles, your question in the chat. It's an email address, and I'll drop it in right now as far as how you reach out to tech support. So we'll see you all at 11:25. Take a quick break, get a cup of coffee, and we'll be back in a minute. Okay, great. I think we're ready to get started again. Can you hear me all right? Don't want to take this for granted. It was hard to achieve, so happy to be able to be with you all this morning. All right, so the aim of this next section is to talk through the prescriptive checklist, pathway 3, and the performance and innovation path, which is that whole building method. The prescriptive checklist path is essentially a simplified method that rewards teams for both design and procurement reductions. In order to be eligible for using this checklist, you have to meet a series of prerequisites. So I want to talk quickly through what these prerequisites are. The first is that your structural type must be majority type 5 construction, which is stick frame. You have to not have any new attached parking that was built as part of the project you're undertaking. You have to not be using HFC-based insulation. We can talk more about what that means. It's a blowing agent type that's associated with some traditional formulations of insulation. You can't have carpet for more than 30% of the flooring area for your project, and you can't be using synthetic stucco or brick as exterior cladding. So as long as you meet all of those conditions, you are eligible to use the checklist. When you're using the checklist, the way it works is you basically have to earn 10 points across the checklist. That includes both penalty points that are basically a negative value that's assigned to your project, and strategy points that are a positive value. And if the sum of your penalty and strategy points is more than 10, then you pass. And then you provide the documentation to support those claims, and this becomes your documentation method. This means that you may not need EPDs to comply. This is rewarding things other than your procurement-focused supplier-based strategies. I think with that, I'm going to go into the checklist itself. There's really no other way of explaining it other than just showing you what it looks like. So I'm going to start with a blank copy of this checklist. Can you see my screen here? And the zoom level is appropriate. You all can see? Okay. So it's structured in 5 parts. The top of the checklist gives you some instructions, tells you how to read the form. It's basically comprised of drop downs and text entry. So the white is really the only part you have to fill out as a user. And it's basically a questionnaire. It's asking you whether or not your project is using specific strategies and how your project is designed. So in part 1, you would fill out your project type. This is associated with the wider DEQ program and your applicant guidance that sets up whether you're a space efficient project or an adaptive reuse project. So that same distinction is available here. And that actually influences how the points are earned over the full checklist. So it's really important to get that dropdown filled out, and it affects everything else. The second part is your prerequisite strategies. You would read through these strategies and use this dropdown to indicate yes or no. Yes, my project is primarily stick frame. Yes, my project does not have parking, and so on. You also have to indicate documentation here, and I'll give you an example of that, really describing where in your project documents a compliance reviewer like ourselves can validate that that claim is relevant and is accurate for the project. So part 2 is prerequisite strategies, and that will basically tell you whether or not you can use the checklist. So for example, if I'm a space efficient project and I meet all of these prerequisites, I indicate yes. The checklist tells me you can proceed. You are able to use this checklist to move forward. If that's the case, you would then roll into part 3, which is your penalty points. And this is basically working against your strategy points. These are some moves you might make on a project that actually are working against your overall point reduction total. So if you have a higher window to wall ratio than is typical, or if you're using a pretty carbon intensive cladding system like aluminum, steel, or metal panel, you'll have a small negative that you have to overcome with the strategies below. So if, for example, if I say, My cladding material is aluminum, then I'm going to start with this -5 points, and I will then need 15 strategy points in order to overcome that negative. But for many projects, I think they'll start with, not using metal panels and have a window to wall ratio less than 25%. In that case, you don't start with any penalties. The core, the kind of heart of this strategy here is part 4. And this is where you're working through individual measures that you've taken at the project level to reduce embodied carbon. These are organized into 3 sections: structure, enclosure, and interiors. And here it's more selective. You don't need to fill out every single dropdown. You can really focus on the things that your project is doing. It's really important to understand this line item. I'm going to emphasize this, which is that you can only earn one of the multiple options in the strategies that are grouped with the same letter. So you can see these are 4A. You only can earn one of those 4. Or for 4B, you can only earn one or the other, but not both. So this is just a way of making sure you're choosing between these options. You can't take credit for both of them. And we'll be checking that when we're determining compliance for your project. I'm going to save the details here for the secondary example, but basically you come here, you can do one of the 4A strategies, one of the 4B strategies, one of the 4C strategies. And what happens here is if I indicate yes for the softwood used on the project being salvaged, and I am a space efficient project, I'm getting awarded those 3 points. So you kind of are visually able to see here which points are relevant for the project type that you are associated with. All of those strategy points get summed, and then the compliance evaluation part in part 5 basically is drawing information from other pieces of the form. So part 5 here will basically check, can you use this checklist? Yes or no? How many penalty points did the project earn? And you'll notice this is going to match what you're seeing in this part of the form. So if you do have a penalty, -5, that will populate down below. Your strategy points from part 4 will populate, and then those will be summed together. So in this case, you have not yet overcome the -5 you started with, and this project would not pass, although this is not a realistic scenario, of course. The other feature I want to note before I answer the question that I'm seeing in the chat is these 2 lines. This is really important. And basically what these 2 lines make possible: enter the equivalent points earned from low carbon procurement in pathway 1, or enter the points earned from low carbon procurement in pathway 2. So basically, you're able to incorporate points that are earned from pathways 1 and 2 in this checklist if you wish. So if I'm in pathway 1 and I've earned, you would not need, you already comply in Jordan's example here, but this line at the bottom of these checklists is going to convert your project and the points that you've earned associated with these other pathways into something that's compatible with pathway 3. So if I had a less rosy picture down here, maybe I'll take out or I'll make some changes live here about what my actual reductions are. I'll set this to 6 or 7. Let's say I have 7 points here. I didn't make it all the way. I'm not complying in pathway 1. I can actually move over that product level reduction that I've earned and take credit for it in pathway 3. And that's really important because that's allowing you to take credit for both design measures and procurement measures. And we want teams to be able to be rewarded for both. So this is the way you would do that. And we can get more into the details via technical support, the emails in the chat, or later in the Q&A. I'll pause there and then I'll work through an example. Any questions? I'll start with this one in the chat. So when you say attached parking, do you mean a parking structure? Yes, that is correct. We mean a parking structure. Any other questions? Let me know if I'm missing any raised hands too. Okay, great. So I'm now going to look at an example of this form where it's been filled out. So for example, this is a project that is space efficient. We've gone through part 1 and indicated that it's a space efficient project type. And we've indicated that we've met all of the prerequisites. What I want to highlight here is it's not enough to fill out the dropdown. It's also really important to help indicate to your reviewer where that criteria is documented. So if I am mostly type 5 construction for my project, where could somebody find that information in the drawing set? So for example, here we have a note that that information can be found on S100 on a specific page in the construction drawing set. For example, on no attached parking, that might be shown on the site plan. You might indicate that that's on the A100 page. So we're really looking for teams to basically help us help you reviewing your strategies by indicating where in the project set you've shown and you've documented compliance with these strategies. And that's really true throughout. So you both need to actually comply with these strategies on your project and then show us how via your construction drawings. And in some cases, receipts or other documentation could be used as well. But I think because many of these are really design side measures, they're not about a specific product. Construction drawings are a good source for how this information gets communicated. As an example, if you meet all of the criteria from part 2, and you can use this checklist on your project, let's say you step into part 3, and you do have a window to wall ratio on the project that is greater than 25%. If that's the case, you would indicate yes, and you would start with that -5 penalty, and then you'd be working through the rest of the checklist in order to make up for that. And some examples of how you might do that. So in section 4A, you have 4 different options. You could use the points from your EPDs for concrete, for example, and pull in those points from pathways 1 and 2. Or you can actually use a simplified method that refers to cement content. So the amount of cement in your mix as a simplified measure to indicate your concrete is lower carbon. And I'll show you what that is when I go back into the presentation. So for example, on this project, I know that I'm meeting the cement content limits. And in this case, for my documentation, I'm indicating that I've shared 3 submittals for the 3 concrete mixes on the project that document that I'm compliant with those cement limits. So that's an example of a documentation type that has the necessary information to support this claim. Maybe I don't have any of the compliant foundation systems. I'm not using salvaged framing. So I come down to this enclosure section, and I do have maybe roof cavity insulation that is loose fill cellulose. So if I'm able to, indicate that that's a yes and show on the drawings where that's described, that's a form of documenting for this project. On page 49 or on line 49, it's also giving credit for the exterior cladding type, the material type that's installed. So maybe this project uses engineered wood or natural wood as the siding material, and there are points associated with that. Maybe you're drawing the reviewer's attention to the elevations where that product is noted. And then finally, as an example, this project might be using more than 70% of the flooring area is some combination of these materials like sheet linoleum, ceramic tile, or engineered wood. And some points are associated with that. So in this case, the project has earned 16 points in terms of strategy, 5 points in terms of penalties. Those are pulled into the bottom of the form, and this project would comply. There's more documentation that might be needed around receipts as well in order to get the rebates for the program. So in the program guidance, we'll describe, how this documentation might show up in the form, and then also how that relates to the rebates. Any questions on this? I know we are quickly running out of time. Yes, there will be a manual with these instructions. Thanks for answering that, Jordan. Okay, I'm going to jump back into, go ahead. Okay, so not a question in the chat. Any other questions before we jump back in? Right.
We do have a new set of questions in the chat, Aurora, and I think it's going to be a mix of CLF responding and DEQ responding. The first one in particular, DEQ can respond to. So space-efficient rebates are available only for long-term rentals for households earning up to 120% AMI. Is that correct? Owner-occupied units won't qualify. Is that correct? So the units can be owner-occupied, but we do have a limit here as far as what that rental limit income is. If it will be owner occupied, we can talk with your project team as to how we kind of document any affordability component related to that. We anticipated most of these would be rental occupied, so that's why we focus there. But if we do need to discuss that owner occupied, Kevin, we're happy to do that. And then two, I'll maybe toss this one over to you all at CLF. And actually, maybe while you all are reading it, and for the sake of the recording, for anyone who watches this and doesn't have the chat, I'll just read it out loud. So Jordan shared a lot about EPDs. The acronym is mentioned one time in the DEQ application guide, and I wasn't familiar with it. Thank you for sharing the EC3 database. I wasn't aware of that either. If one doesn't already exist, it might be helpful to have a database of building material manufacturers in the Pacific Northwest, because if EPDs aren't available, perhaps lower transportation impacts would help a project qualify for a rebate. For DEQ CLF, it also may be helpful to have a sense of where materials are being sold currently and if there is a reason materials aren't being directed to in-state housing development. That said, I may be placing too much emphasis on use of local resources. Aurora or Jordan, would either of you like to jump in there?
Sure, I'll give it a try. Really great questions and great points here. The EC3 database does provide a map function. So if you're searching for products, it will show you, if you click on the map function, where these products exist. So if you don't want to sort through by manufacturer or plant, you can look at the map and figure out essentially where is the closest product that has an EPD to you to minimize transportation distances. Your point about transportation is a very real one and a good one, in that some cases you may have a product being manufactured 50 miles away that may be lower carbon than the product manufactured 500 miles away, but the one 500 miles away has an EPD. This is always a hard question, because one of the things that we're trying to do, not just in this program, but more broadly with EPDs, is that we really want manufacturers to measure and disclose the impacts of their product. And when they do, we can reward them by doing that. And so it's really hard to make a judgment call on whether a local product is lower carbon than a product that is sourced from further away if you simply do not have information about how that local product is produced. Often we also see that the transport of that material from manufacturing point to the project site is often, for most materials, lower on the impact spectrum compared to the manufacturing impacts. So it's often that A1 to A3, how the material is being made, is a much larger impact than it is getting the product to your project site. So that's why we still emphasize that we're trying to focus on those materials that were manufactured with lower impacts, even if in some cases they're not local. There's a ton of other really good reasons to buy local. And if one outcome of this project is that we have more local manufacturers produce EPDs, then that would be a fantastic outcome. Lastly, as far as it might be helpful to have a sense of where materials are currently being sold, if there's a reason. That's a good point. I think we're gonna have to think about that one a little bit, and as to whether or not we're able to provide any guidance or more resources on that one. And I'm reading the third question right now, if anyone else wants to chime in.
Yeah, I can jump in on this one, and just to I'll summarize it, but essentially, have we discussed how building codes affects embodied carbon? Is there an effort underway to modify building codes to reduce embodied carbon, and also keeping in mind that there are certain parts of building codes that may necessitate the use of higher carbon materials. The example being wildland urban interface areas may need to use things like metal roofing or cementitious siding that have higher carbon. Really great points there as well, Kevin. We at DEQ do work directly with the Building Codes Division. We assisted them in putting forward a legislatively required report to study the opportunities for reducing embodied carbon in building codes. And we did also share the resources that CLF has developed with them for their input. So yeah, point well taken. Sometimes they might not align, and then sometimes they won't have any impact on each other. So that'll just be something we navigate along the way as well. And then I know we're running up on time, so just briefly, these last couple questions. Can we get a copy of this slide presentation? We are recording this and intending to share that, so you will have access. And then, yeah, Jamie, thanks for sharing your experience that most of the products are easy to find, even at Home Depot. The program is set up pretty well and requirements are simple. Most contractors can knock this out pretty easy. Additional cost around 5%, so very doable. So thank you for sharing that.
Awesome. All right. The only thing I'll add to that is the cementitious siding and metal roofing. I'll say in the prescriptive checklist, as an example, neither of those is rewarded, but neither of those is penalized either. So if you have cementitious siding and metal roofing, that's actually not going to work against you in pathway 3. You could continue to have those as part of the design of your building, and you'd need to earn points via strategies elsewhere on the checklist, but that won't work against you in this particular version of the checklist. Just to summarize, this method is meant to be simplified. The goal is to earn these 5 points through the pieces of the checklist form we just went through. One of the ways it's different than the other methods is it emphasizes B4, that replacement stage emissions. So that means that there's slightly more points available for shorter life systems, specifically cladding and flooring, than may be available in other methods. So that's kind of a benefit, this more emphasis on cladding and flooring in this pathway. As I showed, you can also earn points if you know you're filling out the information for pathway 1 and you can't get across the finish line. You can basically take those points over into the checklist and then continue from there. So you can build additional strategies out in the checklist as one option. We're happy to keep explaining that too if it's confusing. I know this is a lot to take in. The reporting requirements for the prescriptive checklist include that form that we just looked at, as well as the documentation notes that will likely involve referencing drawing sets, as well as receipts and environmental product declarations. You would only need environmental product declarations if you're using this Pathways 1 and 2 method. So you would still have to provide all of the documentation associated with Pathways 1 and 2 if you want to earn those points in Pathways 3. All right, the last thing we want to cover today, I don't think we're going to get a chance to talk in too much detail about Pathway 4, but the last thing I wanted to share around Pathway 3 is the focus on these simpler documented methods in the guidance. So as we referenced, you may not be able to find environmental product declarations for concrete. It depends on where you're located in the state of Oregon. There are many EPDs available and many suppliers that are getting comfortable providing EPDs. But if you're unable to find a supplier who can work with you on EPDs, you still have another option. And that's in the format of this table, which is your cement content. And cement is really the most impactful ingredient in your concrete mix. So if a supplier is able to reduce cement content, that's a proxy. It's basically a signal that that mix is lower carbon. So we're offering this alternative method where all you would need to document is the pounds of cement per cubic yard of concrete that are complying with one of these two limits, tier 1 and tier 2, and those correspond with different points in the checklist. So this is basically an alternative to an EPD in the cases that you're not able to find a concrete supplier who can make that happen. I want to highlight there is a guidance document that will be made available that has a lot of information in it. This is going to provide background definitions, explanations of what we mean by the different products that are highlighted. So just know there'll be more information available soon on that. And then in the last couple minutes here, I'm going to briefly introduce Path 4. I'll be honest, we think it's less likely that a large group of applicants to this program is going to use Pathway 4 because it's more documentation intensive and it involves modeling the whole building. So you really have to know everything that's going into the building to use this pathway. It's a really flexible pathway, and we do think it could serve some projects, but we think it's less likely to get broad adoption across the user group. The way that Pathway 4 works is by using a whole building life cycle assessment. And this model is then used to show a 10% reduction against a project-specific baseline building. This method is really flexible, so you can actually reward a project for reducing material quantities. I'm using less concrete than I might otherwise. You can reward material alternatives, so I'm using loose fill cellulose instead of EPS, or product alternatives. So that might be a lower carbon mix design, like we've discussed. Ideally, the way this would work is a project team who's interested in learning about how to do whole building LCA would start this model early in design. They would develop a baseline model and input all of their project information. And the best way to use this tool is to iterate over the course of the building and explore design opportunities. How can I pick an alternative system here or look at the impact of this choice or that choice? And that's ideally how this process would go. You would use this model as an iterative tool. But the documentation at the end of the day would require you to model the actual design. What does my final housing project look like? And what is my baseline design? That's a basically industry standard version of your building. So it might have more traditional systems modeled. And then you would calculate a percent reduction between the two and need to achieve that 10%. To give a little context, building life cycle assessment is a very common way that this embodied carbon work is done in bigger buildings. There just is not as much uptake of this method in housing. So it's very suitable for housing. We just are also trying to offer simplified pathways and save this group time. The way this works is it uses a combination of project-specific data, like our material quantities and emissions factors. So it's really the same logic as what's going on in the other pathways. And it can also model many other parts of the life cycle overall. So it doesn't have to be limited to the product stage, although that's the only piece that is required for this DEQ program. It's also worth noting that the metric you'd be reporting if you choose this method is called Building Embodied Carbon Intensity, which is a total of your global warming potential or your embodied carbon on a per area basis. This metric is really similar to an EUI, if you're familiar with that for energy reporting and energy use intensity. It's like a summary of the amount of energy consumed in a building over the area. So this is really similar to that. It follows the same logic as what you would be doing for the other pathways, but you have to cover all of the materials in the project. So that includes, breaking down your building elements into all their respective pieces in order to generate a very comprehensive bill of materials. Often this is facilitated by tools, lifecycle assessment tools that are on the market. I'm going to highlight the design integrated tools in this column here. These would be the most appropriate for this program if you were to go this direction. Beam is really built out for residential projects. So I would say it's more targeted at housing and residential typologies versus some of these other tools are also available, Tally, OneClick, and Athena. But they also serve, commercial building users. So they're not focused on housing. It's also possible, I want to say, to use the tool that Jordan just described, EC3. It has another component in it called the Project Builder that you could use to document compliance with this program. That's not always the case. It is the case for this program because we have such a narrow focus on the product stage impacts of A1 to A3. So to summarize, really, this pathway is focused on structure, enclosure, and interiors. So that same set of systems that we saw in the pathway 3. We're asking that folks document still A1 to A3. We're being very narrow about the stages, the piece of the supply chain we're focused on, and the need to demonstrate the 10% reduction. I'll say you could optionally add other stages of life. So to the person's question in the chat that was asking about transit emissions, if you felt like that was a big picture, a big influencer on your project, you really sourced locally, you could add transit as one of the stages covered and optionally report more stages. The guidance makes it clear that that's a possibility for you. But like Jordan mentioned, it doesn't often swing the picture because transit impacts tend to be small compared to manufacturing. This approach is really flexible. You can model almost any strategy using this method. So for some projects that might be attractive, but you have to build a baseline building that is functionally equivalent. And that's a bit of a technical rabbit hole, but it really means that the baseline building and your actual building have to meet the same criteria. They have to both comply with the same codes. They have to have the same R values in their envelope, for example. Here I'm listing the same tools we just looked at that would comply with the program and reiterating the reporting requirements. So this slide can be a reference, when we share the deck later on. We're running out of time here. There's also a bunch of guidance in the guidebook that will be shared that describes what pieces of the project are required to be reported. And I think this is indicative of why we're expecting fewer projects to take this direction. There's just a more comprehensive list of what you need to consider in the building that would need to be reported to use this method. There's also discussion around what kinds of things you can model, what you can take credit for. So this will all be coming in the guidance that we'll make available. With our 1 minute remaining, any questions?
Hey, Aurora, maybe just for the sake of the recording, we could finish out by talking about the resources that are coming and then maybe hang out for a few more minutes if people do have questions they want to ask. So if you just want to advance the slide, I want to emphasize that this video will be a resource for people. And if you want to keep going, there's a couple of other resources. The applicant guidebook is already available and on the website. What's coming in the next month is the compliance guidebook. These will be detailed instructions of how to comply and how to use individual spreadsheets and reporting forms, and a lot of details in there that we've covered today. Number 3 is a bunch of fact sheets. These are educational fact sheets to help project teams get up to speed on embodied carbon. Not everybody likes to read fact sheets, so we're also including videos. Number 4 is a playlist video for those who would prefer to watch someone use the EC3 tool or learn more about embodied carbon. And last but not least is the direct technical assistance. We've dropped this email in the chat. Please do reach out to us. This is part of our job, is to help project teams go through this program. We want to see this be as successful as you do. And so the earlier you reach out, the more likely we're going to be able to help you more effectively. So thank you all so much for attending. We are at the top of the hour. And I just want to maybe, if there's any last words from the DEQ team, please let us know. Otherwise, Aurora and I could hang out for a few minutes here and answer any questions that have come up. Great. I see that we're starting to lose a couple of people. Understood. There's a lot of content we covered today. So why don't we end it there? You all know how to reach us. And thank you all for coming. We're really excited to be a part of this program. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks
Thanks
Great
so much,
job.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.